Welcome everybody to today's webinar of the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament on the recovery plan, a crucial moment for the EU. We are with MEP Bas Eickhout. He negotiated the recovery plan resolution of the European Parliament on behalf of the Greens EFA, and he's our climate expert. We have with us Rasmus Andresen, member of the Greens EFA, and member of the EP negotiation team on the multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, which is the acronym for EU budget. We are talking recovery plan and MFF now, a package the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, Commission President, presented today to tackle the economic crisis caused by the coronavirus. And the proposal of the European Commission goes well beyond the Merkel-Macron proposal, and with a huge amount of payments, we will talk about that later, and with rule of law, conditionality, and the Green Deal, to put it in a nutshell. My name is Pia. I'm press officer with the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament, and I'm happy to moderate today's webinar. We will have around 1 hour's time, and we have more than 300 people who registered for this event, and even more watching us live on Facebook and YouTube. So please send us your questions in the comments, and we will be happy to discuss after a short introduction. I'm a very, very warm welcome to our two guests today. So with us, Katrin de Vries. She's professor of political science at Bocconi University in Milan, Italy. She's affiliated professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and an associate member of Nuffield College University of Oxford. And she's doing research in the areas of political behavior, political economy, and EU politics. Currently, Catherine is working on a research project examining how economic hardship affects support for socially conservative political agendas. And her new book is titled Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe. And we also have with us Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, previously led DGAP's Research Institute, and she's a non-resident senior research fellow at the Johns Hopkins University, and she has been publishing on several EU topics and of a large variety and scale, like borders, closed borders, Brexit, and the German Constitutional High Court. So we will start our debate with a short introduction from Bas Eickhout on the recovery plan. Bas, is this plan paving the way to a green transition and a greener Europe?
Thanks, Pia. And apologies that you can't see me. This has to do with apparently all the versions I have on my device. So you're looking into a black hole now or something. I don't even know. Is this paving the way? I think the short answer is yes. But of course, the devil is in the details, and not all details are there yet. So in that sense, I would say the jury is still out, but I think what today's proposals is putting on the table is ambitious and is absolutely going into the right direction. And I think it's also what Europe really needs. And maybe I'll just start a bit with that. I'll try to keep it very brief, right, on what are the plans around on the table, but. I always try to compare it with, if you look at the national state aid that is being asked by all the EU member states now over the last 2 months, then we are talking about state aid, so that countries are giving to companies, etc., to avoid bankruptcy. In those 2 months, we have seen requests for state aid for the entire EU as a whole, more than 2,000 billion euros. And I repeat, 2,000 billion euros, because that shows you the huge amount of money that is needed and that is poured into our economies now in order to prevent further economic decline. But we do know that there will be further economic decline. And what we want is, of course, to prevent a new economic crisis. I think 10 years ago with the euro crisis, We also poured a lot of money to save banks. And then very soon after, we had an austerity agenda to cut our expenditures. And that deepened the crisis, and that deepened the unemployment in Europe. And I think everyone learned from that crisis and realizes, let's prevent another deep economic crisis. And that means that we need to stimulate our economy, put an investment program there. And of course, countries are doing that, but in order to make sure that as an EU, we keep that internal market together, because at the moment, it's the countries with a higher fiscal capacity are more capable of throwing in money. For example, of these 2,000 billion euros, half of it is being done by Germany. So that shows you already that the economic divergence is almost going beyond. So we need an economic investment program. And this is exactly what the Commission is now proposing. It's for the level of 750 billion, which is, of course, a lot of money, but it's still small compared to the 2,000 of state aid that is already in 2 months required. So 750 billion is not a huge amount, but it is an important, good amount for an investment program. And there the Commission very clearly stated that they want to invest it into new priorities of the EU, being the Green Deal and digitalization. And this 750 billion will come on top of the EU budget that we have there already. So together we are talking about almost 2,000 billion. So the budget plus this recovery fund. And hopefully, of course, that will be used to really stimulate our economy and to let recover our economy, but not just recover to business as usual, but also really to get to a green and innovative new economy. And the ingredients are now on the table. Now it boils down to how will the details look like and how will the expenditures exactly going to look like. And that is still a political debate, of course. But the start is very, very promising. And that's why the Greens also welcomed this proposal today.
Thank you, Bas. Rasmus, on the MFF, maybe you want to give us a bit of insight about is what the Commission proposed today the accurate instrument, or is it the accurate volume to tackle climate change and challenges ahead?
First of all, the structure is interesting. The structure the European Commission chose is quite interesting, and maybe also looking back some weeks ago, we never had thought that this would happen. And this is because the economic policy the Commission is proposing is changing from coming with recommendations of cutting national budgets for some states in the crisis into having common European investments. And that's quite good. And also to do that within the European budget, so that we are having guarantees in the European budget for European programs is quite good. And of course we are supporting that. And of course this is something we have fought as Greens for many years, and now this crisis maybe gives us the hope to get a new structure also for the European budget and for the European economic policy. And then of course we have to look on the details, and that's what we are doing after having supported the structure and the proposal today. So in the next weeks we have to look on the more than 2,000 pages on the proposal from the European Commission, and we have to look on what does that really mean. I fully agree with Bas Eickhout that the overall priorities seems very good, like climate change, fighting climate change, digital, but also some health programs. But in the end, we have to look on what that really means. And before our web event, I had a hearing with the commissioner, the budget commissioner, Johannes Hahn, and we asked him some questions, for example, about raising the climate spending target, where we all know that the 25% the Commission will spend on climate is not enough to solve the climate crisis. And of course we need to fight there, and we need some more ambitious climate targets for the recovery instrument, but also for the other parts of the MFF. And we also need to look on some of the spending programs we already have, and to see on which harming effect they maybe also have on the climate on climate change. So that's, I would say, a key fight. And another key fight will be the discussion about the so-called own resources, European taxes, you could call it, where we can see that there are some good elements in the proposal today. We can see that the Commission is proposing a digital tax. We would welcome that, and that the European Commission is also proposing a European carbon border tax, so that products we are importing from different parts of the world will be carbon taxed. And of course, that's a good step. But now we need to look on what does that really mean, and will we have an agreement with the member states, for example, on these very important instruments, or will there be a political declaration that will mean at the end that we will not get these kind of taxes? And that's where we need to be more concrete in the next weeks. But of course, there is a chance for changing Europe, and it's more concrete than it has been, and we had expected it some weeks ago.
Thank you, Rasmus. Now I'm happy to open the floor to our two guests. It's our pleasure to have you here. And let's start with Katrin de Vries. And please give us a bit of bigger picture. So what is the crucial moment for the EU?
Yeah, so thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me. I hope that the connection also stays well. So indeed, this next generation EU, as how the plan is being dubbed by the European Commission, is vast and it's fast. So in that way, it's very different than in 2010, where many political scientists and economists would agree it was too little, too late. So it's desperately needed also to come up with a recovery plan, although, you know, we've talked about that the details are not clear yet, and of course member states need to agree. But today also the European Central Bank adjusted its forecast downwards. So they're expecting now a decline in the Eurozone economies of 8 to 12% of GDP. So just to put that into perspective, this is a recession that will be twice as deep as 2008, the financial crisis. So in that way also really we need to think about new instruments. So while member states, and they've been called kind of the frugal four, so I'm not sure I like that term so much, but anyway, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands and Sweden have been trying to get at, you know, the most out for themselves. That's also what one hears about. That's why the Spanish are proposing what they're proposing. Italy is proposing what they're proposing. The Commission really needs to think about the EU as a continent, an ambitious program for the EU to protect public goods. The single market is one, the environment is another. So we talked already about it, 750 billion of loans and gifts in exchange for strong economic reforms and investment in climate change and digitization next to the multi-annual or the MFF, the multi-annual framework. So in order to not get these contributions of national member states to go up too much, which is really not popular, especially not in those states that I mentioned, the frugal four, the Commission advocates borrowing money on capital markets and levying taxes on polluters and tech giants. And this is also, as was just referred to, you know, some member states might like that, some might not. So it'll be interesting to see. So clearly the Commission has committed to certain priorities, so green, digital, innovation and health. But indeed the fine print will be crucial to check also when it comes to providing money to countries that do not respect the European foundations of rule of law. So the ambition is needed as a signal to capital markets because bonds of, for example, Italy and Spain are under threat, but it's also needed to prepare the continent for enormous international and internal challenges. And I think that maybe in public opinion, it's not as clear yet as to maybe some politicians of how deep this crisis will be and what the challenges will be. So internationally, I think this pandemic has revealed already or had made clear the changes that we see in a global force of power. This is really the first crisis in decades where we don't see the US taking a leading role, far from it. It's in isolation. China is trying to fill this vacuum. For example, in the country that I live, Italy, it's been very active. In this kind of rivalry between China and the US, Europe will have to protect its interest. and a vigorous and joint and inclusive recovery is going to be crucial. So the core values that are underlying the developments of the EU, peace, democracy, rule of law, multilateralism, economic freedom, social security, and also recently the environment, are becoming increasingly under pressure internationally. And institutionalized cooperation in a time of pandemic, it's become so clear that we need it. However, it's become really vulnerable. And in that way, the kind of unique model that Europe has developed needs to be protected in that international sphere. But internally, and I think Bas Eickhout already referred to it, there are also crucial challenges. So the pandemic has widened the gap between the South and the North that was already there, leftovers from the previous crisis. And that makes really policy making much more difficult and has also politicized European action much more. So Northern member states have more fiscal space to stimulate their economies, to prevent bankruptcy from firms and unemployment, and also to get a more speedy recovery. And Bas already mentioned it. There's been Margrethe Vestager, the Commissioner of Competition, has already approved 2,300 billion in state aid, so really huge amounts. And about half, 47% of that is going to Germany. Just in contrast, the country that has had to lock down its economy the longest and has been affected by the pandemic the most, Italy, is getting 18% of that. So the differences in recovery that were already there from the last crisis, and we saw the recovery much slower in the South, and they were getting ahead, and now they were hit by the pandemic even more, really threaten the functioning of the internal market and the four freedoms that Europe tries to protect. So an ambitious recovery fund is essential to ensure, and I think this is really important, that every citizen and every company, regardless of where they're located, have a good chance to come out of this crisis. So it's not just about solidarity, it's also about self-interest, because if you export in that market, you're equally going to have a share in that. So the joint recovery at this time will allow Europe to protect its kind of social model, which has become quite unique globally, and we often also don't see that. We had good healthcare systems that are able for people to access them freely. They're not having huge debts like in the United States. We don't have, 50 million unemployed. It's a very, very different model, and that needs to be protected, and choices will need to be made. But it's also, I think, clear that the political necessities of joint recovery have for public opinion. So what was interested in also the naming of this plan, so Next Generation EU, is the fact that we see actually a lot of generational divides also in public opinion. So some of my own research has really shown that even if we think that Europe belongs to the youth, we see huge differences between the South and the North when it comes to the young. So, for example, Le Pen in 2017 presidential election was more popular than Macron among the 18 and 24-year-olds. And also 60% of the millennials that voted in Italian elections voted for Salvini. And part of the research that I show is the fact of huge youth unemployment that hit these generations, and that they didn't necessarily see any way future. So really, youth employment is a key channel through which crises are being transmitted. We saw a lost generation in the South last. We cannot afford seeing a lost generation again. So by investing into into younger generation and recovery, the Europe is actually also investing in its political capital in the future. And I think it's especially important now, and this is what I will end on, is that my ongoing research has seen that also public opinion really expects the EU to act when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to the green. This was studies I've done with the Bertelsmann Foundations. These were really priorities that people saw for the Commission. I'm not saying that every member state is going to like them, but actually many citizens do. But also the economic crisis presents a possibility, what we know, for people to turn their backs against government, to turn their backs against the EU. We see historically that there's often a far right turn in an economic crisis. So if we can compensate some of the effects for particular people, we can really also mitigate the crisis and how it affects people individually. So I think this constitutes a make or break it moment for European leaders, and they will have to choose. I think von der Leyen today referred to it as a binary choice. Either you're in it or you're out of it, and you're doing it by yourself. And many citizens will look to their leaders, so their prime ministers, their presidents, to try for them to make sense of Europe. So I think a lot of this will also be the choices that European leaders will make. Citizens are ambivalent what to think, and that makes them very open to elite messages. So I think it's now really the time for political leaders not to hide behind public opinion, but to shape it and to showcase how integral the EU has been for protecting this unique European social model that protects jobs and the environment for generations to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. I would like to encourage everyone who's listening to write your questions and comments. And now I give the floor to Daniela, asking, many people wrote about this proposal today as a possible turning point or a game changer. Is it to lift the European project to a new level?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on this good day, because I do believe that the proposal does lift the EU to a new level. The point is, in my view, that we see an emerging, I would say, stronger fiscal capacity, and this is a debate which has been going on for a very long time. Now, what is in the proposal, and I don't want to repeat much of what was said, or as little as possible, really, is the question, how is the money going to be raised, and in particular, then also, how is the money going to be refunded? And obviously, it is clear that the European Commission will go to the financial markets and raise money, which it can, first of all, because the instruments are already there. And then secondly, because it has such a good reputation that it has a AAA rating with the collective guarantees of the member states behind it. And this allows Europe in this very crucial moment to raise enormous amounts of money, which we at this point really need. But then the question is, how is this going to be reimbursed? And as the proposal looks at it, probably we are moving into a situation where taxes can be introduced at a European level. It was already mentioned, it could be a digital tax, it could be a tax on carbon dioxide, which would be good for obvious green transition reasons. But the point really is, if this happens, this is a new quality of European integration. And last week, when the Franco-German proposal was put out, there was this sudden discussion about the question, is this a Hamiltonian moment or not? And I believe the Franco-German proposal as such isn't. But we may be moving into a direction where at some point, the European Union does get a very different political quality when it is able to raise taxes, which brings the necessity for democratic legitimacy with it. And at this point, of course, the European Parliament has to play a stronger role. So bottom line, I agree to everything that was said on the necessity, first of all, to have the big amounts of money, in particular, as we heard today from the European Central Bank, that the growth perspectives are even worse than the European Commission said a few weeks ago, when we thought it would be probably 7% of GDP losses. Now it's a bigger number, as we heard. So money needs to be there. It needs to be spent in a way that it enhances convergence. And obviously in the German press, immediately the numbers were out. How much does Germany get? How much does Italy get? How much does Spain get? And it is absolutely right that Germany gets only small amounts, if at all. Because what matters from any country's perspective, in my view, and I say this consciously as a German, in particular for our country, is that the Eurozone and the single market holds together in this situation. And that is not only a financial and economic question or argument, but also a social and political argument. And the necessary conditions for this need to be put into place. So convergence plus the ability of the European Union to manage a very ambitious transition agenda. And this was already said in the field of green transition, but also with regards to digitization. At a moment in time where we are under pressure from the outside world, the big power battle between China and the United States matters enormously to Europe. We need to make sure we are competitive and we retain our sovereignty, and we invest at this point where it is very difficult to invest in the future technologies we need, and not only for economic competitiveness reasons, but because we need to guarantee the basis of our democratic model. So we have to have control over certain areas of technology, for instance, because we see how they can be used against democracies. And my final point is that the proposal that is out today in a very important way refers to the principles on which the European Union has been built. And the issue of rule of law and democracy has already been mentioned. For me, this is key. If we don't manage now, at a moment where we put a lot of money onto the table, to enshrine conditionality with regards to democracy and rule of law, we miss a huge moment. And the European Commission and member governments over the past years have missed many moments in telling fellow member states or EU member states where they are overstepping lines with regards to undermining their own democracy and rule of law in their home countries. And if we don't manage now, at a point in time where we all look at Hungary and ask ourselves how far this can go, and still seems to stay acceptable to some in the European Union, that rule of law and democracy is undermined. My belief is if we don't manage now to introduce this conditionality, we will have a very much harder time enforcing those principles later. And as we know, there are enough actors out there who wish to undermine those principles. So all in all, I think we are moving into the very right direction. But political ambition cannot stop with the agreement on the recovery fund, but the consequences of this necessary step have to be drawn. And at some point, they will touch on fundamental questions of democratic legitimacy, which is why it's great that we have this setting with parliamentarians from the European Parliament to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Now I would like to open the floor up to our audience and our followers. There are already several questions. And maybe we can just link to what you said in your latest sentences, Daniela. One question is quite general, but how about fight against corruption? Maybe you want to comment on this.
Me? Sorry.
Yeah, just because you were talking also about the rule of law. Maybe others want to comment as well, but maybe you can start.
Yes, well, it's absolutely, for me, this is part of rule of law. I mean, it's really part of implementing a rule of law agenda, that every country has the necessary means and measures in place to fight corruption. And there are enough comparative studies that show where member countries are. And we know that for some, there were steps sort of in the wrong direction over the past years. So I firmly believe this has to be implemented. We need to know that the money is spent in the right and correct way. And fighting corruption is key here. And the European Union has its own role to play.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can jump in shortly?
Sure.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's part of the rule of law question, and we really need to see a strong solution there. And then for me, it means also much to strengthen the authorities, European authorities we have. And on this issue, we have the European Anti-Fraud Office called OLAF, and we are always seeing that the budget is for administration is small, and these kind of offices or authorities are the ones the member states want to cut at the first thing. And that's why I think we also need to strengthen instruments like that, because one thing is to have some strong instruments like rule of law mechanism, but then we also need the administration, independent European administration, which can take care of that.
Thank you, Rasmus. And maybe a question which you might also want to answer. I will shorten it a bit. One of the challenges for Earth and human recovery is the time horizon of budgets. How is Greens EFA and the European Parliament rethinking the budgeting process and monitoring metrics to ensure that GND is a really ecological program and not greenwashing? GND means Green Deal, I think.
Yes, I can do that. We had some events and proposed some instruments for really making sure that we have a climate-proof budget. That, for example, means that we need to cut subsidies for fossil fuels, that we need to change the agricultural policy. And of course, we would like to see that in the regulation of the European budget or the new MFF, so that we can be sure that there are some instruments where we also have the possibility to to fight against it if there will still be some climate harming investments in the future. So that's a very important element, and of course we also need to see that in the regulation of the new instrument for really making sure that there is real climate spending and no greenwashing.
And maybe Bas, do you want to add on the Green Deal and avoiding greenwashing?
Well, no, I think Rasmus already said a lot on it, but it is, of course, in the end, the big question and there, to be very honest, the proposals are still a bit sketchy. So in words and in orientation and in targets, it's putting the right objectives there and the priorities. But I think, as Rasmus already said, what the Commission has chosen for is that they do not really touch the MFF. So the kind of the old budget, hey, how you could describe it, that's the classic EU budget still has the two big priorities, cohesion funds and agriculture. And within those two big parts of the old EU budget, not really many changes are being proposed. And that is what Rasmus also said, is still a fight to really get to better programs there. But also there in total, this commission is saying, well, 25% should be going to greening, which was already in the initial proposal proposed by the Juncker Commission, the previous commission. So it's clear that the Commission really decided, let's not touch too much of that EU budget. And then on top of that, we get the recovery fund, and that should all go to the priorities of Green Deal and digitalization. And you could, of course, wonder why not also for the MFF that much clearly. And there, of course, I know the political reasons. Basically, as Katrien said, there is a huge challenge now with a widening gap between the North and the South. If you start really modernizing the total EU budget, you might also get an East-West discussion, and the Commission didn't want that, and I can see that. But of course, that remains then that we have questions on how to make sure that the MFF, the EU budget, original budget, also really, of course, works towards modernization and greening of our economy, which in words is the focus of the recovery fund. But there we still need to see how the linkage with the EU semester, with the national energy and climate plans, it's all put in there, but how that concretely will be developed, that still remains to be seen. So the danger of greenwashing is absolutely there, but of course this is also why we as a Green Group in the European Parliament will make sure that this is not just a greenwashing exercise.
Thank you, Bas. Another question is, I'm interested in your analysis as far as concrete measures against climate change are concerned. What do you see? What do you miss?
Shall I do that one as well?
Maybe also a question to you, Bas. But the others can step in as well, right? We don't really need to have it only question and answers. You can step in anytime you want.
Yeah, I'll kick off, and then others can of course jump in. I think there's a lot of elements that are there which are really good. If you look at the recovery plan, I mean, it's talking about the renovation, which I think is a no-brainer. To be very honest, it's making sure that we are isolating better our houses, which will emit less greenhouse gases, but also will lower the energy bill for all the consumers in Europe. So it's good for the environment and good for everyone's economy. So I think that's clearly a good direction and a no-brainer and an important source of greenhouse gases. It's also, of course, talking about renewable energy and rolling out renewable energy projects. I think that's also something that clearly our energy system needs to be modernized, one of the first. But then, of course, you also get into the discussion because it's also talking about kickstarting a clean hydrogen economy. Well, what do we mean with a clean hydrogen economy? Is that hydrogen on the basis of renewables, or is that also on the basis of gas? And there the Commission until now has included also gas. So that is still a fossil economy then. So maybe not that clean. So there you get a discussion. It's a bit the same with cleaner transport. What do we mean with cleaner transport? Also there, of course, you can get into a discussion around biofuels, etc. And as always, when it's about agriculture, there I have to say that the language really becomes the weakest. So I think the elements are there: a green industry, energy system, transport system, housing, agriculture, land use. It's all mentioned, it's all there, but I would say some of the elements are certainly not fleshed out very clearly, and we will have discussions on hydrogen, on what we mean with clean transport, and certainly on agriculture. As always, there the Commission is, I would say, the least progressive and clearly going for a change in the system, which we are always fighting for.
Okay, and anyone wants to add anything? Rasmus, Katrin, Daniela, you're free also to answer. Okay, there was a different question which relates a bit to this. So the question was, where would the money be spent? And also I want to add, where do you want to spend the money? And there might be quite different angles beyond the Green Deal, maybe. So maybe Rasmus can say something about where the money will be spent or where we want it to be spent. And also I'm inviting Katrin and Daniela to step in.
Well, except from the climate part, I fully agree on what Bas said there. I think we also really need to look on what kind of measures would help for some of the most hit member states. And of course, this will be a challenge because we know that the economic structure, for example, in Italy or in Spain or in Greece is different from the Northern European states. And we really need to look on how the programs will be activated and what kind of criteria there will be as a common ground for the spending in these programs, so that we really can see that we are spending the money also for the states most hit by the crisis. And of course, for us, the situation for the young generation means a lot. So we need also to see a lot more action, for example, on youth unemployment. That's, I think, quite interesting. But we also need to see on which way we can digitalize our infrastructure so that Europe also will be a global leader in the digitalization, maybe not in the same way like we can see it in the US or in China, but we will find our common European way on that. And I think that every member state can provide by that. So maybe this will be my bet of making Europe fit for the next centuries. And then, of course, I think there is a very interesting question or debate about the new health program. What does that really mean? What will the money be spent for? Will it be there to support public health programs, or in which way will there be a public-private partnership or something like that? And I really think we have to look on that. We are not doing mistakes in the way we are spending more money on health. I think it's really good that we will have more health spending in the European Union, but we have to do it in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rasmus. I would also like to ask Katrin and Daniela, where would you spend the money to maybe also beyond climate and Green Deal, but to fight corruption, to fight for the rule of law, or maybe even to fight Euroscepticism? Any ideas?
Well, I guess, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is we simply don't really know how to fund a recovery of this scope that needs to be funded now, and how at the same time transition and everything else can be achieved. So this is really a huge political task to figure that out. And I wouldn't, at this point, I wouldn't identify particular policies, except for the big transition agendas, digital and ecological transition, which I think are key and really basic. We need to do this now, there's no question. But if we think alone of tech, I think there is a huge question: how do we enhance our own sovereignty and competitiveness in that area? And this, in my view, goes through research and development funding. And this is why I think it is very important that we define very clear principles for the expenditure that needs to be made. And I mentioned a few of them. I think convergence is key, respecting the EU's principles that I outlined earlier, and enforcing the transition agenda, which we have all discussed. But rather than that, it's in my view, really important to decentralize the exact spending policies, because countries vary so greatly among each other, and then internally in different regions. If you think about southern Italy, you are facing a completely different situation than around Milano, which compares Germany. So this is, I think, where decentralized decisions need to be made. But the principles are very clear and should apply to all.
Thank you. Katrin, do you want to jump in? How would you spend the money?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a tricky question, right? Because then you also get very much into not just the question, I think, that Daniela already outlined about sovereignty with the national level and how you spend. This is the intrinsicies of European policymaking, right? That, but at least if the EU would have more tax capacity, it should also have maybe more influence on how that's spent. So now the question will be very much on how that will go. But I mean, I think that some of the aspects that you think also about, if I think about it as a citizen, it's like, you know, why can't I take a train from the south of Italy properly to the north of Europe in a fast train like I can do within Italy, right? Or why do I have to switch trains? Or why do, you know, that would be something that I thought would be infrastructure when it comes to public healthcare, even though when it comes to public transport, which might not be so popular in a pandemic time, but nonetheless, you know, we have to really think about that. How do we find different ways in which how we create that market mobility within the EU, so that people can study and live and work in different places, but can do that in a sustainable way, right? So that would be also something that I would think would be a really important aspect that the EU could coordinate on. The same would go, you know, how do we create a health capacity? I know that health is not an EU competence, but or an EU kind of area of policymaking. But of course, in a pandemic, and we're not going to be out of this. This is going to take quite some time. We need to also, develop some capacity. But then I think Rasmus's question on like how do we do that, and how do we involve, how much is there going to be a public-private partnership, and many member states, differ on these kind of elements. I think there's where ideology and politics comes in. So I think, rather than me saying what that should be, I think the European Parliament, I think that's one thing we need to learn also from the last crisis, is that the European Parliament needs to be reinstated. I mean, this Commission president, I'm sorry to say, whatever we think of her, but she was not necessarily coming out of the Spitzenkandidaten procedure. That has also had its effects. So we do really need to see about how do we, rather than indeed saying where are we going to spend it on, I gave some practical ideas, but how are we going to fight that fight about where we're going to spend it on, and what is the role of the European, of accountability, of democracy within that process? And I actually think that the European Commission could have been more ambitious in that aspect, but I think for what Bas outlined, it's trying not to play chess on too many tables. So it's trying to probably deal with this kind of north-south divide, especially. But I think those are really important challenges that we need to think about.
Okay, thank you. I'm just scrolling down the chat because there are several new questions. A question on own resources. How will own resources, which are much needed in order to have a strong MFF to put up with all challenges, how should they be raised? Is there any details in the Commission's plan? Maybe Rasmus wants to answer this question.
Yes, I can try. Actually, we don't know even yet how the concrete structure will be. And in the hearing we had with Commissioner Hahn, he was quite unclear about it, but he mentioned some figures. So he he said that the recovery instrument should be financed also through own resources. He mentioned the plastic tax again. He mentioned a larger a tax on big companies. He mentioned, as I said before, the digital tax and carbon border adjustment tax. And he calculated that this would mean that there will be this would give 30 billion euro to the European budget, and of course these taxes will stay for a very long time. They would finance the recovery fund, the Next Generation EU program, but for the next 40 years. So the repayment will be organized for the next 40 years, and that means that these instruments will stay if there is an agreement for them for the next 30 or 40 years, and that means they will stay forever. And then, of course, it would mean a lot for us to maybe get some more money out of it. I think he calculated that there will be 1 billion out of a digital tax, and I think it's maybe possible to get more out of the digital tax, so that we are taxing Amazon, Google and Facebook and others a little bit more, and then we would also have a little bit more money for the European budget and for some important priorities, as already mentioned by us before.
Could I step in, Pia, there as
Sure.
well?
Sure.
Because I think that very agree with Rasmus, but I think it's also very important that you could almost say we have a bit of time. It doesn't feel like that, but the plan of the Commission is, of course, that this recovery fund, it will be the Commission, the EU, lending money, so from the market. So that's where this 750 billion comes from. The repayment, so it's a kind of a debt that they are willing to take. The repayment will only start in 2028, and then indeed for 30 years. So in those 30 years, the money should be returned. Well, and then to be very precise, of the 750, 250 is a loan, so the ones who are using that, they have to pay, and the 500 billion is a grant, and that should be repaid by those own resources. So that's where the own resources really kick in and really needs to be in place in order for that period of 30 years to repay that 500 billion grant that has been developed. So in a way you can say we have a bit of time, but we will need that, because it's, of course, there you get the fundamental question, who is going to pay for all this? And I think there it is very important that the Commission is linking it to the bigger companies who are profiting from the internal market. And indeed, as Rasmus said, these internet giants, but also some of the revenues of the emission trading system, where there are ideas to include shipping and aviation, and those parts will all be used. But in all the plans of these own resources, it's really the bigger companies that will pay their fair share of taxation. That will go into the pot of own resources, and in a period of 30 years, that will repay the investments that are being done now. So that's the idea of the Commission, and I think that's quite smart, to be very honest.
And I think it's also politically smart in the sense that they are trying to, and sorry, someone asked me, I used the word gift, I meant the word grant. This is from the Dutch translation, sorry. So that there are ties to it, but that there's one part in which, you know, if you think of some form of mutualized debt, which this would be, right, that the Commission would go to the financial markets, this is kind of being perceived as a more temporary solution to this particular problem, while then the taxation would be a more, it's also maybe controversial, but has been less of an issue within domestic spheres in certain countries. So there are also, you know, the own resources, some of it is more temporary and some of it is more long-term. Other people have again then criticized that, well, that's exactly the weakness of it, that some of these things will be more temporary. So we'll have to see how that evolves, but I guess that's been some of the political log rolling or consensus strategy by the Commission.
Thank you. I had another question, which I was just about to lose. Question from Jessica: how can we ensure a gender dimension remains across all areas of the recovery plan and the MFF more broadly? while we welcome a move towards a carbon neutral and digital Europe, these are unfortunately areas which really lack women's representation. Yeah, I will shorten it a bit just to give you more time to answer. Anyone, any idea on the gender dimension, which is not that strong yet? Rasmus,
I can try, but so of course it's a very important point, and of course we need to see a gender dimension in nearly all of the programs in the MFF, and not just when we are talking about health programs or some social programs, because they maybe have a better gender dimension than other programs. And what we are calling for is that we need to get an analysis of the European Commission about which gender effect the different programs have, and then we need to analyze that, and then we need to take the information we get out of the analysis for changing some of the programs. And of course, as the situation is right now, more spending on health, on the social dimension, but maybe also on some research topics would mean that the gender dimension would be even better, but that won't be enough. We also need to look on infrastructure programs, for example, and look on the gender dimension there. And for me, there is a big combination of the gender dimension and also, for example, the climate dimension, because I think we are talking about sustainability, we are talking also about social development goals, and if we are combining these different goals, then we will go some bigger steps in the right direction, also, for example, on sustainability. But it's true, or I don't know if that's what you were expecting, but the Commission is not mentioning it, and of course we would like to see the Commission working a lot more on that. And one of our colleagues in the Parliament, in the Budget Committee, Alexandra Giese, she's pushing the European Commission there together with some NGOs for making more action on the gender mainstreaming for the European budget.
And also, there's a follow-up question on this: how Alexandra's initiative, half of it, is being perceived in the European Parliament. Maybe you know about the other groups, just to add as a follow-up.
Well, I signed the initiative, so I fully support it. And if you are interested in the topic, you should Google it. Half of it, Alexandra Giese, European budget. I think then you will get the informations. And of course, in the budget committee, for example, there's a majority, but for the initiative and for the goals. But I think we really need to see more colleagues involved in it and to really take it to action, because it's good that the colleagues are supporting that, and we will have some majorities also on these kind of topics. But if nothing happens afterwards, then it's not enough. And that's why I think we need to see more action there. But there are some colleagues also in the other groups supporting the initiative, and I know that in our negotiation team for the MFF, we also have some strong women strongly supporting that, and so my hope is that there will come some change also related to that.
Thank you. So we have around 10 minutes left. I'm afraid we cannot take all the questions, but one is from Thomas. There's a huge support for hydrogen in this package, seemingly unconditional. Will we not finance oil and gas industry in the way? Maybe Bas wants to answer on this one.
Yeah, well, that's why I already said that the Commission is always talking about clean hydrogen, which is of course a lovely term, because who can be against clean? But certainly this will get a follow-up discussion, because it's true. I wouldn't say it's unconditional. That's a too strong statement, I would say. But it's absolutely sure that when the Commission is talking about clean hydrogen, they are talking about hydrogen on the basis of gas, and that then linked to carbon capture and storage. It's even thinking of on the basis of nuclear. So we all know for certain industrial applications, we very likely will need hydrogen, but hydrogen is only an energy carrier. So we need to have a discussion on where that energy comes from. And there, for the Green Group, it's very clear that the only clean hydrogen is green hydrogen, so on the basis of renewables. And that can be a very efficient way of getting, for example, offshore wind power transferred into hydrogen and there feed some of the industrial processes with. That's for us what we call clean. The Commission has a bit of a wider interpretation there. And that will be the next discussion, which we will see, which was of course already coming, and now as part of this recovery fund and recovery package, it will certainly become a big discussion as well.
Thank you, Bas. So we took a lot of questions. I'm afraid we couldn't take all of them, but I would love to give the opportunity for our guests and also for Bas and Rasmus to have quick closing remarks of maybe 1 minute, 2 maximum. And Daniela, do you want to start?
Thank you, happily so. Yeah, I think what we are facing at the moment is a huge political opportunity in a deep crisis. I'm not saying that this is a merry moment, but at least the political will on the side of some member states that have been either part of the Franco-German proposal or supporting it, and then now the European Commission to suggest something really big, which is open enough to allow all the important policy goals which we discussed over the past hour to be integrated. This is a huge political opportunity. If there's one downside to mention, I guess it is that the European Commission hasn't touched upon the multi-annual financial framework proposal. I understand for political reasons why this may have seemed the best way forward, but I'm just saying it could have been a more consequential move even. But my bottom line really is this is going into a good direction, and now the next weeks and very probably month will be crucial in actually hammering out the whole package and bringing it into implementation. And if the principles we discussed are part of that, I think it will bring the European Union as such a lot forward.
Thank you, Daniela. Catherine.
Yeah, so I mean, I share many of those elements. I think that this is a huge moment. I mentioned already this is vast with a V and it's fast with an F. So this is really different than in 2010. Also because it's a very different crisis, much more symmetric shock that it's affecting all member states. But I think there's still kind of a rocky road ahead, and especially also a possibility because some of these proposals were not so clear yet that they're going to be watered down and then watered away from really this, idea of a social Europe that has that is interested in joint recovery and that also thinks about the environment as a key aspect of that. So I think these will be crucial elements. I do think that two important pillars should not be forgotten. That's one that Daniela already mentioned, which is thinking about rule of law and how that incorporates, but also thinking about how if we're going to add to spending capacity at the European level, no taxation without representation, we need to really think about how we bring that electoral channel stronger into the European Union. We've seen a move away towards more council, etc., member states. So we really need to think about that and should not forget about that in the future and in the months ahead.
Rasmus, and then the closing remarks from Bas.
Yes, I fully agree, and we can see that budget is not the budget. European budget is not something boring. Some few people has to work on, but that we really need to push for common European solutions. And now we have to look on the details. And my feeling is that we also still need some public pressure, because why are we having the fight against the climate change is a big priority in Europe? That's of course also because of the public pressure and the elections last year, where many people said that fighting climate change is the key priority for their decision where they will make their vote. And we are facing some of the same things now, so we need to go further with public pressure, and it's really important to look on the details and also to follow up, because on the other side there are still many people and some lobbyists who would like to see the proposal weakened, and that's not what we should end up with. And that's why I think it will stay important to be part of the fight and to support the strong priorities Europe has the chance to set now.
Thanks, Rasmus. Bas.
Yeah, I think a lot of things have been said, of course, and agreeing very much with all the points that Daniela, Catherine, and Rasmus made. Maybe just to add on that is that if you just look at now the lessons learned, hopefully, from this crisis, is that we really have to have a bit of a more fundamental rethink of how our economy is constructed. And this is not only a discussion for a recovery fund in Europe or an MFF in Europe. This is a discussion for every country. And we see it, our vulnerability in our healthcare sector, where for some of the medicines we are totally dependent of production in far away. And this huge vulnerability got exposed, of course, quite painfully. But it's also the reevaluation of the public sector. I mean, in the previous crisis, it was the public sector who paid the price. We saved the banks, transferred private debt of the banks into a public debt, and then we started to cut our expenditure at the cost of the public sector. And now every government is saying, well, the crucial jobs are exactly in that public sector. So I think this really shows that there needs to be a bit more fundamental rethink on how our economy is constructed. And absolutely a recovery fund, and very much agree with the other speakers that this recovery fund is a fundamental moment in time for that. But beyond that fund discussion, we will also need a bit more of that fundamental discussion in the different countries. How can we prevent a new crisis? And this is also why we are always talking about resilience, which is a terminology that comes from biodiversity, where our ecosystems should become more resilient towards climate change. Well, I think our entire society and economy should become more resilient to these shocks to our system. And that really, requires a bit more fundamental rethink than what we have seen until now. And in that sense, the discussion on this fund is only the start of that debate, I hope at least.
Thank you, Bas. For me, this was very interesting. I hope for our guests and for our audience as well. Just one comment, which I very much liked from the Romanian Greens about fighting together, tackling climate change and taking climate action together. And I think this is a very nice and positive message to fight together for the Green Deal and for climate action. And yeah, in a way, I give the closing remarks to the Romanian Greens. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Daniela. And thank you, Rasmus and Bas. And a big thank you to the team and all of those who made this possible. It was the first time we used this channel. And hope to see you soon again.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank
Have a nice
you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Have a nice evening, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.